Hi everybody, I'm Michael Stoops here with Meguiar's, bringing you another episode of Shop Talk. And today we want to discuss DA polishing techniques. DA as in dual action polisher techniques. We're not talking about rotaries today. We are really concentrating on the dual action polisher. What does that really mean? Well, dual action polishers have a free rotating spindle, so the pad rotates without the gear set of the motor turning. Once the tool is switched on, it moves that pad in an oscillating pattern as well as rotating. So it oscillates and rotates, hence dual action polisher. Now, we're going to be using the Meguiar's MT300, which is an 8mm stroke tool. Some of you are using 12, maybe 15, maybe even 21mm stroke tools. Everything that we're going to discuss today applies to all of those tools because they're all free rotating spindle dual action polishers, okay? Now that we're clear on that, let's look at some really basic things that you want to keep in mind to start with. Gloves, not a bad idea since we're going to be dealing with a variety of chemicals, compounds, polishes, waxes, sealants. Not a bad idea to wear gloves during the course of a project like this. It's also not a bad idea to have some eye protection on when you're doing this. If you're using a particularly dusty compound, these come in handy, as does a dust mask if you need it. And also not a bad idea, some ear protection while you're working with the tool through the course of the day, okay? Now, a few other real basic things you want to keep in mind. We're trying to make the paint look pretty. Don't let the cord drag on the ground and then bang into the paint. Keep that cord over your shoulder all the time, okay? That'll help keep that away from the paint and let you get on with the progress that you're trying to achieve. Also, even though the pad has that offset to it, when you're mounting the pad on the backing plate, it's really important that you center that up as best you possibly can. Every dual action polisher has a counterweight that's there to counter the weight of the backing plate and the pad to smooth out the inherent vibration of this type of tool. If you've got the pad really offset, you create an imbalance to the tool and it's not as smooth operating as you'd like it to be, and that kind of takes away from the user experience. So center that pad as best you possibly can. Something else you should be doing that we think a lot of people overlook to some extent is cleaning the pad on the fly. Once you've got your compound or polish on there, it's a good idea to prime that pad first and then put just a couple of drops of product on. But as you're working around on your project, it's a good idea to clean that pad frequently. With foam pads, a pad brush works great to knock off that dried product and even some of the paint residue that you pick up. If you're working with microfiber discs, however, we really recommend using compressed air to blow these out because the microfiber really holds on to the dried compound and the paint residue that you pick up. If you want to learn more about the microfiber discs, the entire microfiber system, and that pad cleaning process, we've got a complete video on the microfiber DA correction system. You can check the show notes down below and take you a link straight to that video. Speaking of basics, you know, when we're polishing paint with a dual action polisher, in the most basic sense, what we're doing is cutting, polishing, and waxing using a cutting pad, a polishing pad, and a finishing pad. But it gets a little bit more complicated than that because there are an awful lot of variables involved in this process. What pad selection are you using, right? There's a lot of different pads. Are you going with foam or are you working with microfiber? Another variable is the liquid that you select. Which compound or polish are you going to use for the project? You know, there's a lot of choices there, even within our own lineup, going from our consumer to detailer to the Mirror Glaze Pro line. Meguiar's offers you quite a few options. Don't focus too much on which liquid you're going to select for a given project. I mean, you may, if you've been on social media or you've gone to a detailing forum, you've probably seen somebody ask the question to the group, hey, which compound and pad should I use for really bad oxidation or bad swirls or heavy water spotting and things like that? And if you notice, he gets 20 different answers from 20 different people using 20 different combinations that all work. Why do they all work? Because those users are adapting their variables and their technique for that project and the liquid they're using to get the results they're looking for. The liquid's not a magic, okay? You have to use your technique to get things done, and that's really what we want to focus on today for you. A couple of other variables that you encounter from project to project is just how bad is the paint, how severe are those defects, and how good does it need to be at the end. So if you've got a customer that's paying you for a one-step, Are you going to spend 15 hours making that paint flawless? We certainly hope not, because that's not very cost effective or time effective. There is a variable, however, that you cannot change, and that is the paint in front of you. Whether it's hard, soft, or whatever, that paint is the paint that you have to focus on, and that's where your user variables come into play to get the job done. All right, so let's dive into these 5 user variables that you have complete control over that work together to get you the result that you're really looking for on the paint. And the first of those is where you set the tool speed. Now, this is going to vary not only based on how severe the defects in the paint are, but how hard or soft the paint may be. And also, are you compounding, or are you polishing, or are you applying a wax or sealant at this point? Again, in the most basic sense, generally speaking, we're going to use a higher tool speed when we're compounding. We'll slow it down a little bit when we're polishing, and then we'll slow it down a bit further when we're applying a wax or a sealant. But where do you really run that tool speed? In the past, it was actually very common to run with very high speed on the tools, because we'd use a fair bit of pressure. Because back in the day, earlier generations of DA polishers didn't have a lot of torque. So you had to overcome that with a user technique. Well, today we've got high torque tools with much more aggressiveness in the pads and much more aggressiveness in the compounds. So we've had to really kind of adjust in general our technique when using a DA when it comes to tool speed. And what we're finding is a lot of times the paint actually responds better with perhaps a little bit less speed than you may have thought previously. Now, when you're doing your test spot, and by the way, we've got an entire video on how to do a test spot. Again, check the show notes down below. We'll have a link to that for you. And you can find out everything you need to know about how to do a test spot. But in the process of doing that test spot, you're going to really dial in what's the best speed for that paint when you're compounding, polishing, and waxing. And again, compounding is probably going to be the highest speed of those 3, polishing a little bit less, and waxing even slower. So generally speaking, a higher tool speed setting will give more cut, but you don't always want to go to a higher speed, because sometimes more aggressive actually can create some issues, haze and things like that, that you may have to overcome later. Sometimes you can actually get a better result, a quicker result with a little bit less tool speed, but it's a huge variable that you get to control. The second of our 5 user-controlled variables also has to do with speed, and that is your arm speed across the paint, or how quickly or slowly you're moving the pad and the liquid over the paint and giving it time to interact. So if you think about it, the abrasive or the aggressive nature of the pad and the abrasives that are in the liquid have to interact with the paint in order to correct the defects. And if you move very quickly across the paint, you're not giving them time to do that job. So when you're compounding, generally speaking, you want to move pretty slowly across the paint. The harder the paint is and the more severe the defects are, most likely the slower you want to move to give that much more time for everything to interact with the paint and get the job done. But just as we altered our tool speed when we changed from compounding to polishing, you may find when you're polishing you can move maybe a little bit more quickly. Again, that all depends on how the paint responds. You get to vary how quickly or slowly you move across the paint. Once we get to the point where we're applying a wax or a sealant, at that point really all we're doing is spreading the product out of the bottle and onto the paint. You can move quite quickly to get that part of it done. So let's take a look at just what this looks like, slow arm speed versus a faster arm speed. So number 3 in our user technique variables is pressure, specifically how much pressure you're putting down on the tool to get that pad and the compound or polish to interact with the paint. Now, with some older DA polishers, we used to talk about using enough pressure to just about stop the pad from rotating and then ease up a little bit. Well, the potential problem with that is modern tools have a lot more torque than the older tools did. So if you put down a lot of pressure, you're still going to get quite a bit of pad spin, especially at a little bit higher speeds when you're compounding. The downside to that is too much pressure can actually start to generate more heat than you may actually want. Remember, modern catalyzed paint really doesn't like a lot of heat. And instead of really heavy pressure to get the job done, if you ease up a little bit on that pressure and keep the pad rotating, you get those abrasives kind of tumbling against the paint, you get everything interacting with the paint more. You seeing a theme kind of created here? We want that interaction with the compound and the pad on the paint to remove the defects. So if you're using too much pressure and you're slowing the pad rotation down too much, not only can you be generating heat, which is bad, but you could also be slowing down your correction, which is also bad. So adjust that pressure accordingly depending on what it is that you're trying to accomplish. And again, when we're polishing, we're probably going to use a bit less pressure. When applying a wax or a sealant, you're probably going to use the least amount of pressure on the entire project, because at that point, remember, all we're doing is spreading out that product onto the paint. We're not trying to fix anything anymore, so you don't need to be aggressive at all. Number 4 in our list of user-defined variables is pad angle. Now, by this we mean trying to keep that pad as flat as you can on the paint. If you've ever polished paint before, you know that very few cars have truly flat panels. There's always some sort of a contour, but you want to keep the pad as flat to the paint as you can. The reason for that is if you start lifting up a bit, what happens with that free rotating spindle on a DA polisher is you'll stop that pad rotation and then your cut's gone. Even if the pad's spinning, this area that's off the paint, you're obviously not cutting there. You're losing a lot of your footprint. There is, however, a time that you actually want to angle that pad up a little bit and do some edge work, as we call it. If you've got some more severe defects, maybe an etching from a bird dropping or something like that, and you need a little extra punch in that small area, sometimes working up on an edge like that a little bit can actually help you get more aggressive in that small area to get rid of that defect. But what you really need to be aware of is as a body panel contours, and this is very common that the hood kind of rolls down. It doesn't just slope, it actually changes its contour. And what we see a lot of people do is as they're pulling the pad back, they're a little stiff in the upper body and they just pull the tool straight back, and this part of the pad comes completely off the paint. So you're not contacting the paint, so you're losing cut there, but if you're keeping the pressure up at an angle like this, you're going to stop that pad from rotating and your cut's completely gone. So what you want to do is be very aware of that pad contact on the paint and roll that tool as that contour changes. Don't just pull it straight back. Number 5 in our list of user-controlled variables is the size of your work area. And there's kind of a natural change that happens here from compounding to polishing to waxing, as we've talked about. When you're compounding, you're probably going to be working the smallest area of those 3. We generally talk about maybe a 2 foot by 2 foot square, perhaps even smaller if the paint is harder or the defects are more severe. When you're polishing, you may or you may not open that space up a little bit. It all depends on how the paint's responding, whether you have haze that you have to get rid of, things like that. When it comes to applying a wax or a sealant, at that point, as we've said, you're just spreading the product out onto the paint. You're going to cover pretty large areas at once, basically get the entire car covered. But you could do a couple of panels with one application of product onto the pad. But the reason we want to keep that area small when we're compounding is for the same reasons that we don't want to move really fast over the paint and that we want to keep the pad rotating. We need to be able to give time for the abrasives in the compound and the characteristics of the pad to interact with the paint. And if you're working a very large area and you're covering large swaths of territory, this spot that you touch now, as you're moving back and forth over here, it's a long time before you ever come back to this again. If you're working a smaller area, you'll hit it more times before the product starts to dry out. You're going to get a better result. The harder the paint, the more severe the defects. When you are compounding, keep that work area quite small. 2 feet by 2 feet is about the biggest you'd want to go. Sometimes we talk about the size of one of our Supreme Shine microfiber towels. Work in the width of your shoulders is a great tip as well. Keep that work area small when you're compounding, let it grow a little bit, maybe when you're polishing, certainly when you're applying your wax or sealant. So those 5 user-controlled variables obviously come into play throughout the process of polishing on the car. Something that really helps you with that a lot is good quality lighting. Now, it's pretty easy to come by overhead lighting, but is it really sufficient to see those defects in the paint as you're working on a car and trying to remove them? Maybe not. What's really a nice tool to have, something like our MT103, this light gives you variable light output intensity and variable color temperature that really helps you see those defects, whether it's right on the top or when you're starting to work down on the sides or in tighter areas where maybe you can't see as well because your overhead lighting doesn't really illuminate it for you. And what's nice with this is the little foot on the bottom will allow me to even stand it right down on the floor to illuminate this work area while I'm going at it, but I can hand hold it and really inspect very thoroughly the areas that I'm working on to make sure that I'm getting rid of those defects and maybe help me adjust one or more of those user variables to get the results that I'm looking for. Now, speaking of smaller areas, what do you do here when your pad is so much bigger than a small space on something like this bumper cover, maybe a license plate pocket, maybe you've got side skirts or some other features on the car panels that really don't work that well with a bigger pad? We actually make a 3-inch backing plate that works with our MT300 Dual Action Polisher. And then we offer all 3 of our foam pads, the cutting pad, the polishing pad, and the finishing pad, in the size that fits the 3-inch backing plate. And we also have the microfiber cutting and finishing discs to go along with it as well. And this gives you pretty much the perfect size to work in those tighter, smaller spaces, including the A-pillars, to get the job done and make that paint look every bit as good as the paint on the rest of the car. So the user techniques that we've been talking about are variables that you adjust in order to get the result that you're looking for. There are some other techniques that you have to adjust and adapt with, and that is when you start working on different contours on different body panels. Working on the hood of virtually any vehicle or a door is fairly straightforward because they're about as flat as you're going to get on most cars. But some cars have these convex curves and some concaves, and they come in pretty varying degrees, and sometimes how you adapt to those really makes a huge difference in your comfort working on them and actually the results that you end up getting. So let's look at how you might want to address some of these. On a concave where it kind of drops down in, it's not too severe on this car, but we still might want to approach this from 2 different directions, right? Come from the top and come up from the bottom so that you kind of meet in the middle. Because what's happening is you're trying to work on a curve like this, and if you just go back and forth across it, your pad can kind of bridge across and you don't really end up hitting down in the bottom. So we'll come at it from 2 different angles like this, meeting in the middle, and get the results kind of across the board. On the other hand, when you're dealing with a convex where it's an outward curve, it's kind of like this, you run the risk of cantilevering the pad, and that's pretty much the same as just running the pad up on edge, which we've already determined stops rotation and loses cut. So how do you overcome that? Keep the center line of the pad in contact with the paint. So you're kind of rolling that pad to go with the contour, keeping the center line of the pad in contact. That pad will continue to rotate, you'll continue to cut, you'll get rid of the defects, the entire car will look fantastic when you're done. All right, so to review real quick, those user-defined variables when we're working with the DA polisher, your tool speed, your arm speed, that pressure that you're putting down on the pad angle, and the size of that work area, and these are all controlled by you based on how the paint's responding and the result that you're looking for, okay? On some paints that are really hard or the defects are really severe, you may need to keep your compounding to a very small area with very slow arm movements, maybe a little bit more tool speed, and keep that pad really rotating to let everything kind of tumble against the paint and really get the job done. Some other paints may be a little bit easier to work with or a bit more forgiving. You may find you can go to a little bit larger work area, maybe even ease up on your pressure, maybe even slow down the tool speed a little bit. You find all that out when you do your test spot. Speaking of which, if you look down in the description, we have a link to our test spot shop talk video that'll really get you dialed in to get that paint dialed in. And if you want to learn more about our microfiber correction system, well, there's a link to that video in the description as well. By all means, make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you'll get notified when our next videos come out. And you know what? We are all over social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Instagram, we're on Twitter. We've even got our own forum at mcguiresonline.com. And don't forget to give our Solutions Hub a call if you're in the middle of a project and you've got a question or something's not behaving the way you think it should. They're always there to help. We're always there to help. And we appreciate you being here to check us out with this edition of Shop Talk. Thanks again. We'll see you next time.